Welcome to our training on permit-required confined spaces. Many workplaces contain spaces that are considered confined because their design hinders the activities of those who must enter, work in, and exit them. These areas are referred to as confined spaces. If you must work in confined spaces, you may face an increased risk of bodily injury, illness, and death. Course, you will be able to list the differences between permit-required confined spaces and non-permit-required confined spaces. Identify the hazards associated with confined spaces. Recall the roles and responsibilities of the confined space entry team. Identify what should be included on an entry permit and other procedural safeguards when conducting a confined space entry. And know how to respond to emergencies. Note that if you work in a permit space, you will be provided additional training on your company's specific confined space entry procedures. Confined spaces are found in almost every industry. These spaces can be extremely dangerous. When work is to be performed in these areas, confined space entry safety procedures must be followed. These procedures were developed to protect you when working in and around these spaces. Remember, any entry into a confined space must be taken very seriously. Your life may depend on it. To let you see just how dangerous confined spaces can be, let's review a fatal incident in a confined space. Consider this fatal example. A 23-year-old employee sitting in a looped chain was lowered approximately 5 meters into a manhole. 20 seconds later, he started gasping for air and fell from the chain seat face down into the accumulated water at the bottom of the manhole. An autopsy determined oxygen deficiency as the cause of death. The first step in developing a confined space entry program is to identify all enclosures at your facility that have the characteristics of a confined space. A confined space is difficult to enter and exit, and large enough for one to enter completely, but not designed to be occupied. There are basically two types of confined spaces, those that require a permit and those that don't. Next, you must evaluate each of these identified spaces to determine if it is a permit-required space. Your ability to recognize the difference between these two types of confined spaces is critical. Let's learn how you tell the difference. A space is considered a confined space if it meets all three of the following criteria. Is large enough and configured so that an employee can bodily enter. Has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. For example, tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, hoppers, vaults, and pits. And is not designed for continuous occupancy. The next step is to complete an assessment on the space to determine if the space is a permit-required confined space or a non-permit-required confined space. For a space to be considered a permit-required confined space, it must first be considered a confined space and then also be potentially dangerous because it meets one or more of these descriptions. It contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. It contains a material with a potential for engulfment. It is configured in such a way that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated, or it contains other serious safety or health hazards. Examples of permit-required confined spaces include sewers, sump pits, equipment access points, material collection systems, and many other similar types of enclosures. Let's try an activity to make sure you understand the distinction between confined spaces and permit-required confined spaces. After each description, read the question and then select the correct answer. Let's look at this sewer entry. The employees could be exposed to the following potential hazards: engulfment, presence of toxic gases, for example, hydrogen sulfide, etc., presence of explosive flammable gases, methane, etc., and oxygen deficiency. Is this a permit-required confined space? This worker is cleaning a bulk storage tank. He has the potential to be exposed to the presence of explosive and/or flammable gases, oxygen deficiency, and toxic gases. Is this space permit required? This worker is performing repairs in a pipe chase, which has restricted access and is not designed for continuous occupancy. Is this a permit-required confined space? This worker is welding inside a large diameter tank. He could be exposed to explosive flammable gases, oxygen deficiency, and toxic gases from welding fumes. Is this a permit-required confined space? This worker is in an HVAC ventilation duct. His access is restricted and the duct is not designed for continuous occupancy. Is the space permit required? After you have identified all of your facility's confined spaces, you must then evaluate each of these spaces in terms of existing or potential hazards. Be especially careful when evaluating a confined space that could contain an atmospheric hazard. The only way to know for sure that an atmospheric hazard exists is to test for it from outside the space. You should never assume a confined space is hazard-free. Let's review another fatal example involving an atmospheric hazard in a confined space. A 28-year-old welder entered a narrow steel pipe to grind a bad weld at a valve about 10 meters from the entry point. Before he entered, other crew members decided to add oxygen to the pipe near the bad weld. He had been grinding intermittently for about 5 minutes when a fire broke out, enveloping his clothing. Another crew member pulled him to the pipe entrance and extinguished the fire. However, the welder died from his burns the next day. When dealing with hazards in a permit space, you should assume that the most unfavorable situation exists in every case, and that the danger of explosion, poisoning, and asphyxiation will be present at the onset of any entry. Those who enter a permit space face two kinds of hazards, atmospheric and non-atmospheric. Atmospheric hazards affect the air in the space and can be flammable, toxic, corrosive, or asphyxiating. Flammable atmospheres are usually the result of flammable gases, vapors, or dust that have accumulated in the space. In addition, flammable atmospheres can occur from an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. Oxygen-enriched atmospheres greatly increase the risk of fire or explosions. They usually happen where there is inadequate ventilation. Sometimes the type of work being performed can also create a flammable atmosphere. Examples of the types of work that can cause a flammable atmosphere include spray painting, coating, or the use of flammable solvents for cleaning and welding or cutting with oxyacetylene equipment. If you detect a toxic substance during your pre-entry testing, you should review the appropriate safety data sheets to determine what type of personal protective equipment is required, the potential health effects, the permissible exposure limits, and any other information needed for you to work safely. You may be able to prevent or control the buildup of toxins in the air by properly ventilating the workspace. If a toxic atmosphere exists, a respirator is required. Remember, the early stages of toxic poisoning may include nausea and headache. Repeated or prolonged exposure to some toxic atmospheres may cause permanent damage or cancer. Another type of hazardous atmosphere you may encounter is a corrosive atmosphere. Corrosive substances destroy living tissue. Some cause immediate damage to skin and eyes. Some have temporary effects that may pass without medical attention, and some may cause cancer with repeated or prolonged exposure. If you must enter a corrosive environment, you should try to remove or isolate the hazard first. If that isn't possible, entrants need to wear personal protective equipment, PPE, such as a respirator or protective clothing, even if the space appears to have been cleaned. Some examples of corrosives you may come in contact with include chlorine, ozone, hydrochloric acids, sulfuric acid, ammonia, and sulfur dioxide. Some permit spaces may not have enough oxygen for you to breathe, creating an asphyxiating hazard. Oxygen can be consumed by bacterial action, the formation of rust on exposed metal surfaces, or simply by the number of people working in the space. Oxygen can also be used up by performing work such as welding, heating, cutting, and brazing in or near the space. Oxygen-deficient atmospheres are sometimes found in sewers, storage bins, wells, tunnels, and grain elevators. These types of spaces must be properly ventilated to be safe for you to enter. An oxygen-deficient atmosphere is very dangerous. It can affect your heart rate, muscle coordination, and breathing, and eventually it can lead to death. Let's try a couple of knowledge checks. Read each question and then select the best answer. Which atmospheric hazard is associated with rusted surfaces? A. Asphyxiating atmosphere. An oxygen-enriched atmosphere with inadequate ventilation may create which atmospheric hazard? A. Corrosive atmosphere. B. Flammable. Non-atmospheric hazards, on the other hand, include many different conditions, including mechanical dangers, loose materials, accumulated water, excessive noise, extreme temperatures, low light, difficult access or tripping hazards, slippery or inclined surfaces, and hazards from activities going on adjacent to or near the confined space. We will discuss a few of these hazards next. One of the most hazardous kinds of confined space is one that combines limited access with moving parts from mechanical equipment. These are called mechanical hazards. All rotating or moving equipment within a permit space, such as pumps, process lines, and electrical sources, must be identified. If you are servicing these types of equipment, you can be seriously injured or killed if the energy isn't properly controlled. Physical hazards, on the other hand, are often harder to control than mechanical hazards. Physical factors such as heat, cold, noise, vibration, and fatigue can contribute to accidents. These factors must be considered for all confined spaces. Remember, failure to identify all of the hazards when working in a confined space can be a deadly mistake. Let's try a couple of knowledge checks. Read the question and then select the correct answer. Which of the following are examples of mechanical hazards in a confined space? A. Electrical sources. B. Pumps. C. Noise. D. True or false? Heat, cold, noise, vibration, and fatigue can contribute to accidents. Working in permit spaces is a team effort involving authorized entrants, attendants, and entry supervisors. Each of these key players' activities is critical to a safe, successful project. An authorized entrant is a person who has been properly trained in confined space entry procedures and is authorized to enter a specific confined space. Entrants must be able to take certain actions and know the requirements of the confined space program and the conditions that must be met for entry into a permit-required confined space, conditions or work practices that may produce a hazard, and hazard recognition and use of atmospheric testing devices, including information on the mode, signs or symptoms, and consequences of overexposure. The entrant must also be knowledgeable about use of personal protective equipment, including rescue harnesses and respiratory protection, maintaining communication with the attendant, alerting the attendant when conditions change, evacuation procedures, and emergency and non-entry rescue procedures. The attendant is an individual stationed outside the permit space who monitors the authorized entrance. The attendant is responsible for controlling entry into permit-required confined spaces. They also must be able to take certain actions and be knowledgeable about hazards, including the signs or symptoms and consequences of overexposure. Know about possible behavioral effects of hazard exposure in authorized entrants. Continuously maintain an accurate count of authorized entrants and accurately identify who is in the permit space, and remain outside the permit space during entry operations. The attendant must also have the ability to communicate with authorized entrants as necessary to monitor entrant status and to alert entrants of the need to evacuate the space. Monitor activities inside and outside the space to determine if it is safe for entrants to remain in the space. Summon rescue and other emergency services as required. Warn unauthorized persons to stay away from the permit space and perform non-entry rescues if needed. The attendant must not perform any duties that might interfere with his or her primary duty to monitor and protect the authorized entrant. The entry supervisor is responsible for the entry into the confined space. The entry supervisor must know the duties and responsibilities of the authorized entrant and is responsible for the following actions: verifying that all tests specified by the permit have been conducted and that all procedures and equipment specified by the permit are in place. Terminating the entry and canceling the permit when either the job has been completed or a condition that is not allowed under the permit arises in or near the permit space. verifying that rescue services are available and that the means for summoning them are available, ensuring that entry operations remain consistent with terms of the entry permit and that acceptable conditions are maintained, removing unauthorized entrants, and determining the type of work to be conducted in the space. Now that you have identified the key players on your team, each of the team members must be trained. Training is the most effective way to ensure that all of your team members can identify permit space hazards, know how to control them, follow entry procedures, understand the procedures for entry, and respond appropriately in case of an emergency. The entry team must receive training when any of the following happen: before permit space duties are assigned or changed, when there is a change in permit space operations that presents a new hazard for which your team hasn't been trained, or when your team doesn't follow entry permit procedures. Training should be provided at least annually, and your employer should certify that all members of the entry team are qualified to make a safe entry. We've spent some time looking at the roles of the different individuals involved in a confined space entry. Now we're going to describe key responsibilities of each role. Drag to match each responsibility to the person whose job it is, the authorized entrant, the attendant, or the entry supervisor. Before your team enters a permit space, written safe work procedures covering all aspects of the entry process should be developed. Critical elements of the permit-required written program are covered next. You must complete an entry permit that verifies the permit space is safe for the entry team to enter. The entry permit documents acceptable entry conditions and verifies that the space is safe. Click the link to see a sample confined space permit. The permit should contain the following information: location of the space, purpose of entry, entry date and the time workers enter the space, authorized entrants' names, authorized attendants' names, entry supervisor's name and signature, and hazards in the space. The entry permit should also have this information: how workers will control hazards so that the space is safe to enter, acceptable entry conditions, testing data and testers' initials certifying that the space is safe to enter, names of emergency responders and instructions for contacting them, communication procedures used by authorized entrants and attendants, a list of all equipment necessary to ensure entrant safety, and a description of any other permits entrants may need to work in the space, for example, a hot work permit. It's time for another knowledge check. Read the question and then select the correct answer. Which of the following information is not often included on the entry permit? A. Authorized entrance names. B. Authorized entrance job descriptions. C. Purpose of entry. Or D. Names of emergency responders and instructions for contacting them. When planning your entry, it's extremely important to remember the following factors: the type of confined space, access to the entrance, and the number and size of openings, barriers within the space, the occupancy load, and the time requirement for exiting in the event of an emergency, the estimated time required to rescue an injured worker, and the atmospheric conditions and potential hazards. There are also several safeguards you must perform before making your entry. First, you must guard the space. This is done by placing warning signs or barriers to keep out unauthorized persons and to protect the entrance from falling objects. Any area considered to be a permit-required confined space must be posted at all entry points with a warning sign reading, "Danger, permit-required confined space, do not enter," or similar wording. Next, you should take steps to isolate the space from any mechanical, hydraulic, or electrical hazards. Identify who will perform the task and who will inform the entrance about the location of the hazardous equipment. Methods of isolation you might use include isolating energy sources through lockout-tagout procedures, purging, inerting, flushing, or ventilating the space to eliminate and/or control any atmospheric hazards, using barriers to protect those in the space from external hazards, and verifying and monitoring the conditions of the space as safe for initial entry and for the duration of the task. Let's try another learning activity to review. Drag to match each of the elements to the correct safeguard, guarding the space or isolating the space. As we said previously, before you can enter a permit space, you must either eliminate all hazards in the space or control them so that your team can do their work and leave the space safely. There are 3 types of controls that may be used: engineering controls, work practice controls, and personal protective equipment. Ventilation is one of the most common engineering controls used in confined spaces. The permit space should be ventilated until the atmosphere is within the acceptable ranges. Work practice controls reduce or eliminate the hazards by making changes such as rotating workers, reducing the amount of worker exposure, and housekeeping. If the engineering controls or work practices don't eliminate or control the atmospheric hazards, then PPE must be worn. The entry supervisor is responsible for testing for atmospheric hazards in the following order: first for oxygen, then for flammable gases, and finally for toxic gases. These tests should be conducted in a manner that allows you to observe the test and the results. The test results are then recorded on the entry permit by the supervisor. Click here to view more information on performing atmospheric testing. Your team must have the proper equipment to do your tasks, including rescue equipment, and they need to know how to properly use it. The following equipment should be readily available and maintained for your entry: testing and monitoring equipment, ventilating equipment, and communications equipment necessary to communicate with those inside a confined space. You should also have this equipment readily available and maintained for your entry: PPE for hazards to be encountered when engineering and work practice controls do not adequately protect you, barriers and shields to protect you from external hazards, ladders and similar equipment needed for safe entry and exit, and rescue and emergency equipment for permit space entry, except to the extent that off-site rescue personnel provide the equipment. Before your team can be authorized to enter a permit space, the entry supervisor must make sure that experienced emergency responders are available if help is needed. Responders must be trained in confined space emergency rescue techniques. Attendants must know how to respond to emergencies, including the following: whom to contact and how to remove entrance. Moreover, you should ensure that at least one member of the rescue team holds a current certification in first aid and CPR. Emergency responders can either be on-site or off-site. Responders must be able to meet your needs in an emergency. These arrangements are part of your entry supervisor's duties and should be verified by you and your team before entry. The emergency responders must be aware of any permit space hazards they may encounter during an emergency. Responders should practice rescues at least annually. Do not assume that the local fire department is capable of entry rescues. All rescue plans must be coordinated and communicated before anyone attempts entry into a confined space. Let's try some more knowledge checks. Read each question and then select the correct answer. True or false? If engineering controls or work practices don't eliminate or control atmospheric hazards, then personal protective equipment should be used. What is the correct order for atmospheric testing? A. Oxygen, flammable gases, toxic gases. B. Flammable gases, oxygen, toxic gases. C. Toxic gases, oxygen, flammable gases. Or D. Flammable gases, toxic gases, oxygen. Which of the following equipment should be available? A. Testing and monitoring equipment. B. Ventilating equipment. C. Communications equipment. D. PPE. E. Rescue and emergency equipment, or F. All of the above. True or false? Emergency responders must be on site. You've almost completed the permit-required requirements, but before you can enter the space, the permit must be completely filled out and signed by your entry supervisor. The permit serves as your certification that the space is safe for you to enter. It should be posted on the space so that all the authorized entrants can see it. Permits are good only for the time necessary to complete the job identified on the permit. They should never exceed 1 shift. Permits can be canceled by the entry supervisor upon completion of the job, at the end of the shift, or when conditions are encountered that are not allowed on the permit. All canceled entry permits and rosters must be kept for 1 year. Any problems that your team may have encountered should also be listed on the permit. Once the permit is signed and posted, the next step is to prepare the permit space for entry. You should make sure each of these safeguards is in place prior to making your entry. Warning signs or barriers placed around the confined space to prevent unauthorized entry. All tools, safety equipment, and monitoring equipment are placed near the entrance. Mechanical and/or electrical hazards have been isolated. The space has been purged and/or properly ventilated, and the atmosphere has been tested using an appropriate gas monitor. You are now ready to safely enter the permit-required confined space. Once you have entered the space, you should stay in constant contact with the attendants. Make sure that you and the attendants know what communications equipment to use and exactly how to use it. You should also make sure that the attendants continuously monitor the permit space atmosphere while you are inside. They are responsible for maintaining the ventilation during your entry if there is any potential for the atmospheric conditions to change. Read each statement and then select the correct answer. True or false? Before you can enter the space, the permit must be completely filled out and signed by the attendant. True or false? An entry permit should never exceed 1 shift. True or false? You may enter a permit space without a signed and posted permit so long as the attendant tells you it is safe to do so. True or false? Once you have entered a permit space, you should stay in constant contact with the attendants. It is important for you to realize that most permit space fatalities are caused by those who don't understand permit space hazards or who respond inappropriately during emergencies. The majority of confined space fatalities occur among would-be rescuers. Therefore, a well-designed and properly executed rescue plan is a must. Should anything go wrong during an entry, rescue and emergency expertise could be critical. As a permit space entrant, you should wear a chest or full body harness with a retrieval line attached to the center of your back near shoulder level or above your head. Wristlets may be used if it can be demonstrated that the use of a chest or full body harness is impracticable or creates a greater hazard. Also, you must ensure that the other end of the retrieval line is attached to a mechanical device or to a fixed point outside the permit space. If you are working in a vertical type permit space, a non-powered mechanical device should be available for rescue purposes for all spaces 1.5 meters deep or greater. Should an emergency occur while you are working in a permit space, you should be evacuated if any of the following conditions occur. An attendant observes a potential problem that can affect you, such as failure of a ventilation blower, activation of an alarm that signals a hazardous change in atmospheric conditions, and/or you believe you are in danger because you observe signs and symptoms of a hazard in the space. In the event that an entrant becomes unconscious, attendants must not attempt to enter the space to perform rescue. Rescue services that can be performed safely from outside of the confined space, such as hoisting a harnessed entrant, should be undertaken. All team members in the space must immediately exit the space and only provide assistance if it does not endanger them. If this happens, the attendant should immediately contact the emergency responder. Read each statement and determine if it is true or false. The majority of confined space fatalities occur among would-be rescuers. If you are working in a vertical type permit space, a non-powered mechanical device should be available for rescue purposes for all spaces 1.5 meters deep or greater. If a confined space entrant becomes unconscious, other entrants should remain with that person until emergency responders arrive. You should now be able to list the differences between permit-required confined spaces and non-permit required confined spaces. Identify the hazards associated with confined spaces. Recall the roles and responsibilities of the confined space entry team. Identify what should be included on an entry permit and other procedural safeguards when conducting a confined space entry, and know how to respond to emergencies. Remember, any entry into a confined space must be taken very seriously. Your life may depend on it. This concludes our training.